Hey, party people. Today in this video, while you watch me work on the next steps of my lined leather tank, I'm going to share with you a bunch of tips and tricks on drafting pattern corrections, lining patterns, pressing fabrics, and cutting, and especially at the end, cutting leather. And then in the next series, in this series, I'm going to be sewing the tank, and it should just sewing the tank. Oh my God. That's the thing is like when you're trying to teach while you're making something, it's kind of like everything takes longer because you're doing double duty. Anyway, trying on the muslin one more time, I decided that I wanted to shape the back a little bit and pinch out a little dart in the armhole. But since the strap is thin enough that I can just pinch the whole thing out, I'm not going to sew a dart in the middle of it. I'm going to pinch that closed and then redraw my curve. And if you watch my previous video, then you know I'm still kind of like shaping the strap and the back curves and the front curves exactly the way I want it. And I've done enough cutting, taping, papering this pattern. So what I've done is I've taped the shoulders together because remember how I explained to you, I need all my curves to flow front to back, side to side, always. And then I put them under a fresh sheet of dot paper. And this is, again, another one of the reasons why I love dot paper is because it is just see through enough. I mean, it's still fairly durable, it's much more durable than tracing paper, but it's still see through enough that I can distinctly see the pattern underneath. Set that down, paperweights, 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 and then I'm truing curves, making the shapes look nice, filling things in. You know, I was trimming a little bit from the neck, adding a little bit to the shoulder, just a little bit, you know. So, really kind of fussing and fine tuning the armhole and the neckline because the rest of the body is just an A-line tank. Okay. Doesn't take that much fussing. FYI, seam allowance for necklines are almost always quarter of an inch because they are typically tight curves, especially anything that's like a neckline that's sitting closer to the neck. If you're doing something like completely off the shoulder, then that's different because those are not tight curves. But any sort of scoop, round the neck, jewel neck, crew neck, you're gonna want quarter-inch seam allowance because half-inch seam allowance is just too much fabric and it's going to ripple in the seam allowance or just make a mess. So, whatever the seam allowance is that you're using for like your armhole or your side seam, you want half of that. And then I've traced out the whole rest of the pattern exactly. And I'm going to cut around the whole thing. And then all I have to do at this point is add seam allowance to my shoulder seam. And that's my smallest seam. So just a couple of pieces of paper right there. I like using really heavy duty scissors to cut even thin paper like this. It's just a habit I've gotten into. It actually helps steady my hand and keep the scissors on the table because they're heavy, and it allows for steadier cutting. Okay. When you keep the scissors on the table and you're not like flapping about in the air, it's also safer because you don't have blades pointing, especially if you're in a workroom with other people, or even if you're accident prone to poke yourself. And what I've done with the shoulders is to shape the shoulder seams. So on the self, the leather, the seam allowance is going to be pushed towards the back. But if I also do that for the lining, it looks really bulky right there in the shoulder. So for the lining pattern I'm going to do later, I'm going to shape the seam allowance so that the seam allowance gets sewn and pushed forward. So it kind of evens out the bulk right there. And the way to do that is just to fold your seam allowance in the direction it's going to be pressed, and then cut it out that way, and then open it back up. This is my final muslin that I'm cutting. I'm not going to show you the fitting. The overall look is going to be a surprise, surprise. And then, because I did sew this, it's just the top. I didn't even sew the bottom panels because I'm just testing for the armhole and neckline. I did like how it looked, so we are going to proceed. So I want to see what the finished shape is going to look like. So I top stitched the sew line around my armhole and around my neckline for half of the muslin. And now I am pressing it, pressing the seam allowance under so that I'm going to get the finished edge on this armhole. And I'm clipping around the steepest curves, and I'm going to be doing half the neckline, and then I'm going to try it on and see which side I like best. Now we're moving on to drafting the lining. I have the fit that I like. We're moving on, and we need our shell pattern as the base. So I'm just lightly taping my panels together, putting it under another piece of dot paper, and I'm not going to trace the thing exactly. Okay, if you were listening in on my live stream from just this past Tuesday, we talked about how lining fabrics are not the exact same pattern piece as your shell unless you're doing an underlining. Okay, and so there are some parts where the lining's going to be smaller, and that's going to be the strap, because I want the leather to just fold just a little bit under, and we're going to hold it under with some understitching, but you don't want the lining to show through, like peek out under the strap, when you move around. So you want to keep that nice and tight and tidy. However, for the body of the garment, you want a little bit more free flow movement, just a little bit more give so that things aren't pulling funny. And so I'm actually going to add an eighth of an inch. We subtracted an eighth of an inch all the way on the armhole and the neckline for the strap. I did not add or remove from the length of the strap, and I'm adding an eighth of an inch to the side seam so that you're going to get an extra half inch just around the body of the tank, just enough for give. Not enough where things start buckling and flopping around in there. Just a little bit of wiggle room so the lining doesn't pull on the outer shell of the garment. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing with the back. And then, of course, as always, I'm going to check the sew lines, walk the pattern. Walking the pattern means you put the sew lines together where they're going to be sewn. Make sure that the lengths match, make sure that the curves flow, that sort of thing. Walking the pattern is matching sew line to sew line, pretending you're sewing the paper pieces together. Initially, I was going to have a free lining where the lining was not hemmed together with the shell, and just kind of let it hang. And then after thinking about it, I decided that I wanted to tuck my lining into my leather hem. And so I trimmed off the excess on the pattern accordingly. So before you finish your lining pattern, you have to think about the kinds of seam finishes that you want, especially the hem. Like, seam finishes on the inside of a fully lined garment are not that important because it's all going to be hidden, but you have to think about facings, and uh you have to think about what kind of hem you're going to create and where the lining fits in all of that. The key thing is, especially in a garment that is not meant to be worn open like a jacket, you do not want to see the lining at all. So, if you follow me on Instagram, you might have seen that I threw a poll up in my stories about which lining I should choose. And, technically the cotton shirting won, but here's the thing is you can tell how everyone voted. And so I saw that some of my industry friends who have experience in materials development and luxury retail, they voted modal. So sorry, not sorry. Their vote just weighs a little bit more, a lot more than people who I don't know. Like there could be other people who are also experienced, but I'm going to take the word of my experienced friends. And so I decided to go with the modal jersey. When you're pressing or ironing garments and fabrics, okay, first of all, always start by pressing, ironing your fabric before you cut. If it's going to be washed, I would wash it, but I'm not going to throw this in the washing machine, so I don't feel the need to pre-wash my fabrics. But you can't treat all fabrics the same with your iron. Some fabrics are more delicate and require a more delicate touch. You can't tell in the video. Well, maybe you can because my forearm muscles are straining, but I'm not even resting the iron all the way down on my board and fabric. Like I'm holding it just so that like the weight is pressing and, steaming the fabric, but not smashing it. I'm not even putting down the full weight of the iron onto the fabric because I don't want to stretch the knit as I'm pressing. I'm very careful to kind of like skim over the surface so that I'm not yanking and pulling on this knit. I just have a scrap of this left. So, number one, when you are just sewing from your stash and you have more fabric than you're going to need, and you're going to end up with some leftovers, make sure you hold on to the selvage. You want to keep the selvage because that's what's going to help you cut more in the future. If you lose your grain, okay, if you don't have your selvage, and so you don't know the grain of the fabric anymore, then you can't cut using it for garments. Yeah, I know, like, with wovens, you can, like, pull a yarn and you can find the grain. We all learned that technique in fashion school, but it is tedious and I do not like it. So, I'm gonna hold on to the selvage, and this is why I'm kind of folding it up on one side and keeping the selvage on the other side. And I'm measuring, making sure that the folded width is the same across, so that my fold is parallel to the selvage. And as always, you never cut right at selvage. You always want to start your pattern piece at least an inch away from the selvage. Knit or woven, you just the yarns closest to the selvage, they tend to be a little bit warped. This is not true of selvage denim, like the way they make selvage denim. It's part of why it's so expensive. But for the most part, most fabrics, you don't want to use the slightly warped stuff that's close to the selvage. Get in the habit of always pinning right into your seam allowance and not in the body of the fabric. And for this fabric, it's not going to matter that much. I'm already using silk pins, which are skinnier than your average pins. I use those bright yellow quilters pins for my muslin, so it'll show up on camera better. But these are silk pins. They're super, super skinny and long. And so they're probably going to not leave any permanent holes. But you should just get in the habit of pinning only in the seam allowance so that you're in that habit when you are pinning anything much more delicate or something where the holes will not heal. Now, I made this pattern before I decided to use a knit, so I did not mark the correct notches on this pattern. Knits notch differently. Okay, for wovens and leather, you notch in those little slashes, but with knits, you notch by cutting a little triangle on the outside. Because if you cut into knit, it is so easy for it to snag and run. Okay? Ask anyone who's ever worn any kind of pantyhose, right? So you cut a little triangle and you match those little triangles when you cut knits. Now, I'm not super bothered because these little triangles are going to match up with regular notches of my leather armhole, but and it's such a simple garment. I'm not super fussed about it. Here's the thing, okay? Normally in the industry, you do not cut a half pattern, okay? You cut a full pattern. And by full pattern, I mean you would never cut a little piece of paper and say center front unfold. Okay, that's something you do as a student to save paper, etc. But I blanked out because my leather pieces have center front and center back seams, and so I forgot to fold the paper in half to create a full lining pattern. Another thing about a full pattern is, especially when you get to finalizing a pattern and cutting it out of oak tag, you actually cut two when you say cut two. So let's say you're doing sleeves, you need two sleeves, and so you label your pattern cut two. Then when you transfer it to oak tag, you actually have two layers of oak tag stapled together. You cut out the pattern piece, and then when it comes time to cut, you remove the staples, and now you have two mirror image pattern pieces. And of course, you have to label both pieces. But now you have a full pattern because you have two sleeves, you have a full, nothing on full, just like a full front, full back, whatever you need, that sort of thing. Okay, that's what a full pattern is. So here's my leather, and leather cutting is a beast. Okay, and I enjoy the process of leather cutting. Some people do not, but basically, there's in no particular order. Number one, leather doesn't really have a grain, but some skins have a distinct spine. You can see the spine, the way it's tanned or whatever. So this one doesn't really have a spine, but if your hide has a spine, you need to respect the spine and try to like line up your pattern pieces so that you're respecting the spine. Number two, I tried to like pull like leather pieces and kind of lay out some of my pattern pieces so I can kind of guesstimate how much leather I'm going to need and which skins I'm going to use. They're all different sizes. There's a range, but some are slightly bigger than others. And then there are some where it can be big, but there's a scar in the middle, so I have to cut around it. And when you lay out pattern pieces on leather, you have to be strategic in what pieces get the really nice, smooth, even middle section. Anything that's center front, center back, where it's like right there where everyone's going to see it, especially chest and upper back pieces where more people are going to see it. Now, if an armpit area is a little bit wrinkly, not like a deep fold, but a little bit wrinkly, it's fine. Not a lot of people are going to see that. Here I'm pressing leather, and I always, 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 always use a pressing cloth to press leather. Okay. I never, ever, ever run an iron, not even like a bouncing pressing motion on leather straight. And I use this very sheer polyorganza so I can see what it is I'm doing. Like the worst is when you're trying to press. And here I am pushing down. Leather can handle a lot. And I really want to get some of these wrinkles out. So I am pressing down hard. And nothing is worse than when you're trying to smooth things out and you end up pressing a fresh crease right into your fabric. Because sometimes those things never come out. Okay. So always use a sheer pressing cloth. You can see what it is you're doing in there and press out as much as you can. And when you're laying out your pieces, if there are folds and creases that you can't press through, you can't cut there. Okay. Especially like a center front piece. No, absolutely not. And what you want to do is move, like, you don't have to worry about grain line. So you can wiggle your pieces around so that you're like, if a little tiny wrinkle is only in the seam allowance, that's okay. If you have a bunch of folds and creases, maybe you can fit smaller pieces in there, like under collar stands, um, pieces needed for welt pockets. Those little welt pieces are real small. Um, like pocket flaps, but the underneath one that no one will see hardly. Under cuffs, the inside cuff, where again, not a lot of people are going to see unless the style is meant to be worn folded up. All these little trim pieces that are going to be hidden for the most part. Maybe we'll take a wrinklier one, but you don't want to actually include the fold or crease. You want to cut around it. Okay. Here's the thing about leather. You have to just embrace the fact that they come from an animal, and you're never going to have a leather that is absolutely flat, because the edges of the leather, they are the parts that were, the main part of the leather is the back of the hide, the back of the animal. And the edges of the leather are the parts that used to wrap around the tops of the legs of whatever animal. And those get stretched. And so you see the rippling, like the edges of your leather are going to ripple. And if you see that your leather is perfectly flat, maybe it's fake. Maybe they trimmed off all of that, which is annoying because, I mean, I would prefer to keep it and kind of work with it on my own, you know? So you have to take all those things into consideration. When you lay out leather pieces, you don't have to try to like make sure the whole leather is flat. You do, however, have to make sure that the section that's under your pattern piece is completely flat. So, laying out your pattern piece and your markers, it can be a little bit tricky, it can be a bit of a puzzle game. I enjoy this puzzle game, and I would rather do that puzzle game and then later on cut leather, which is actually easy to cut. Just the actual process of laying blade to leather is actually easy because it doesn't move. Not like organza or silk charmeuse or anything like that. So I would rather enjoy the puzzle of laying things out and then cutting an easy to cut material. Okay. In the industry, what happens is when patterns are finalized for production, the patterns get cut out of a very thick board. Okay. Much thicker than oak tag, like a quarter of an inch. I've seen also thicker. And what happens is these leather cutters, and leather has to be cut one at a time for all the reasons I just listed. And what happens is these leather cutters, they have these boards, these wood boards that are on a slant. This is the pencil I'm using to mark my leather. It is in my sewing tools recommendations list. I'll link it in the video description. But they have these wooden boards and they lay out the skin, smooth it out. They take the pattern piece that's like on like something that's like illustration board, lay it down where it can go on the skin, and then they take these little blades and they just cut. They butt the knife right up against the edge of the pattern piece and just cut it out with these little blades. And I used to work at a leather place where we did tons of the cutting in-house in the back. So I used to watch these guys work and they're so fast. I am watching myself just everything I do is so much slower than pros in the industry. But whatever, this is not my area of expertise. I mean, I know how to do it. It's just being fast is not what I'm good at. So, yeah, I'm just tracing out my pattern pieces and using my ruler. You can use your curves, you can use your ruler as a guide. Don't forget your notches. And I like using this. It's basically a chalk pencil, but it's a mechanical pencil, and the lead is really thin. When you cut leather or any fabric that you've marked in a pen, you want to cut either on the line or inside the line. Do not cut outside the line because the line is already outside your pattern. I've gotten this question before. Where do you cut? Do not cut to include the chalk outline. The chalk outline is an outline of your pattern. So you want to cut the chalk off as much as possible. Okay, you see how I'm trying to smooth out the ripples and like find a flat piece for my pattern to sit. And the way I hate wasting fabric, I'm like always trying to like, can I scooch it? Can I scooch it? No, it's gonna ripple. No. And these pieces are the most important because they're center front top. And I used to sell bags of leather scraps on Etsy. People who do smaller crafts love to buy bags of leather scraps at places like Etsy. So I used to sell them there. Anyway, so always sew as close to the line on the inside as you can. That's the goal, is to cut right there because that's going to be the most exact. If you cut including the chalk outline, even a skinny chalk outline like this, you're still adding a millimeter all the way around. And the more pattern pieces you have, the more distorted your fit becomes once you've cut everything out. Okay, the same is true of the at the paper stage when you're transferring and tracing and adding like all these pieces, all that kind of thing. Okay, and then when you cut your pattern out, you want to like cut the pencil off, but just barely. Okay. Go ahead and check your work. Make sure that after you've drawn the pattern, it's still smooth. There are no blemishes. The interior of the pattern piece is good to go. And please make sure, especially since I only have a half pattern, always make sure to flip your pattern so that you have mirror image pattern pieces. Okay. Cut to always means mirror images. If you want cut to of the same thing, you would mark it right side up, like it has to go in a specific direction, and you don't want the mirror image, you mark it RSU, right side up. But I want the mirror image of everything. So always make sure to flip the pattern. Another really good habit to ingrain in your cutting habits is to always cut your notches with the tip of your scissors. Okay. When you get in the habit of cutting notches with just the tip of your scissors, there's no danger of you accidentally clipping too much and clipping into the rest of your fabric. Okay. Like someone jostles you, someone surprises you, you get jumpy, whatever. If you use just the tip of your scissors, it's only ever going to cut just the little bit. Okay. So just cut right with the tip of your scissors. The end. Do not cut notches with the middle of your blade. It's like one of those little things where at some point it's going to be the best advice you ever got. It's just one of those things that just like little tips to help you just along the way. Um, Always make sure that when you're cutting, you don't have fabric folded under so you're not accidentally cutting into something else. Always make sure that you're cutting a single layer um, so that you're not cutting random weird stuff underneath. And this might be just like a Zoe specific thing, but I try to keep my scraps as long and large as possible so that I might possibly use them in the future for something like welt pocket pieces. So that I don't try to like cut into the sides of the leather too much. I go in once and then I try to like cut all the way around it so that kind of like I try to keep the outside strips as intact as possible. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that later on, if I need some scraps, and I'm always gonna need scraps, like when I'm testing the tension of a sewing machine before I start sewing. I always use the fabric that I'm actually gonna sew to do a trial run to test the tension of my machine before I go, especially if I mean, like now, I haven't sewn leather on my machine in a while, so I wanna make sure because 'cause I've been sewing nothing but muslin for 100 years. Anyway, that's all I got for you up till now. I've cut everything out, and the next video, I'm gonna be sewing this baby up. Drop me all your questions below, video requests, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next video.